Greetings, friends. We have an interesting set of readings this Sunday, which are helpful in that they tell us something important about God's nature and God's mission. So let us start right there with the question of God's nature and God's mission. And when we talk about the nature of God, we perhaps are asking questions like, who is God? What is God like? What are some of the qualities and attributes which we associate with God? In what is referred to as classical or orthodox theology, there are some typical attributes which are fairly standard. There are all the omnis, because they all start with omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, and then qualities like being infinite in time and space, which is a bit like omnipresence, the quality of being uncreated, the quality of being immutable, which means unchanging, because the idea is that you can't be changing if you are a perfect being. You can't exist or go from one state of perfection to another, because that implies your previous state of perfection was not perfect to begin with. But these are just some of the classical attributes, again, that the early church already, the church fathers, ascribed to God. And they're all very lovely, and they speak to God's power and glory and majesty, but I'm not sure how helpful they are in creating a picture of God which we can all relate to. Because the picture created by these attributes seems quite removed from our human condition, from our experience as human beings. And being the season of Epiphany, we have recently celebrated the incarnation of Christ. So we know some of the importance of the incarnation, which is namely that God is born into the human condition. Martin Luther, the great reformer, famously contrasted what he referred to as a theology of the cross with a theology of glory, and he did this partly based on 1 Corinthians chapter 1, which forms part of our New Testament reading for this Sunday. Basically, if you strip everything away when it comes to the message of the gospel, or the message of the cross, which is what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, it is a symbol of shame, of suffering, and of defeat. Now, when we say those words, shame, suffering, defeat, they're not nice words to hear. And generally, these are things which we try to avoid at all costs. And they're things which are shunned and frowned upon within society. And it wasn't very different 2,000 years ago in antiquity. But perhaps the one aspect of the crucifixion or of the cross which we do sometimes fail to appreciate in our modern context is that within the context of first century Judaism, 2,000 years ago, to be crucified in the Jewish psyche and the Jewish mindset meant that you were cursed. And Paul explains this. It goes back to Levitical law. He explains this in Galatians. He says that if anyone is hung on a tree, he is cursed by God. So to suffer crucifixion means that you are cursed, that you are cut off, that you are damned by God. Now, if I ask the question, do you wish to be cursed by God? Obviously, we would all answer no. No one in their right mind wishes to be cursed by God. And yet this is what the cross represents in its original context. So this is precisely why Paul says in that passage that this cross is a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But let us return to the question of the nature and mission of God. And while we don't wish to dispute what are referred to as the classical or orthodox attributes of God, we see, as far as the cross is concerned, as far as the person of Christ is concerned, a different picture emerging. We see here a God who is revealed through weakness, through suffering, through shame, through humiliation, through failure, through defeat. And none of these things, again, are things which we would readily associate ourselves with, or let alone associate with God. And in case you think this is just Paul's spin on the cross and the message of the cross, we see this ethic and we see this ethos throughout the Gospels and throughout the ministry of Jesus. Our Gospel reading for today is a good example in the Beatitudes. Here, Jesus lists groups of people who are especially blessed in the eyes of God. Now, Matthew has changed Luke's version, which was probably the more original version, but if, according to Luke, Luke's version says that those who are blessed by God are the poor, the hungry, and the hated. Specifically, he mentions those three groups. So we know that this is completely opposed to conventional thinking, our own thinking. And it's really something we would believe as being middle-class people in the main. We would rather hope is not true. And maybe this is where Matthew's version is helpful, because he spiritualizes the Beatitudes. So for Matthew, it's not just the poor who are blessed, it's the poor in spirit. It's not just the hungry who are blessed, it's those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So I guess you can say that Matthew makes poverty and hunger an existential state of being for those who do not suffer literal poverty and hunger. And unless and until we enter this state, or something like this state, unless we are forced there, and remember, we usually have to be forced to go there by God, because if you look at the gospel record, it is the Spirit at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. It's the Spirit that leads Jesus into the desert, into the place of desolation and detachment, for the express purpose, we read in Matthew's gospel, to be tested by Satan. The Spirit leads Jesus into the desert, into the wasteland, to be tested by Satan. And unless we are forced to enter similar states of being by virtue of our circumstances and ultimately by virtue of where God takes us, none of what I'm saying now will make any sense. It's usually only once we go there that the penny drops and there's a paradigm shift, there's a change in thinking. You might have an inkling, you may intuit that there's a grain of truth in what I'm saying, but unless we are brought there ourselves, as Paul says in that passage, the cross will remain a stumbling block. It was a stumbling block to Jews, foolishness to Gentiles. It's a stumbling block to the Jewish mindset. The Jewish mindset represents the overly religious mindset, the mindset that is preoccupied with correctness and purity and cleanliness and righteousness, which prides itself on being correct. It's a stumbling block to that mindset, the cross, and it's foolishness to the Gentiles. And the Gentiles, in our modern context, represents the secular mindset. The secular mindset is obsessed with success. It demeans and denigrates failure. It is obsessed with glory and fame and wealth and privilege and prestige. It's foolishness to that mindset, the message of the cross. Now, all of this is not to discourage us, finally, friends. On the contrary, it is to affirm and to support you, to give you the assurance that when these things happen, should they happen, and they will happen if you are sincere about your journey of faith. We cannot avoid it. It's part of our spiritual journey. It's to give you the assurance that though it may not seem like it, God is with you. He will guide you and He will sustain you, and you will emerge from it a changed person. May we go so far as to say you will emerge from it a resurrected person. May God's hand of guidance, protection, and blessing remain upon you. Amen.